The morning mist still clung to the asphalt when Thomas Martin pulled his weathered pickup truck into the familiar parking space at Cedar Ridge Shooting Range. It was 6:45 a.m., exactly 15 minutes before the facility officially opened its doors to the public. But Martin had never been one to follow conventional schedules, not in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and certainly not in the quiet suburbs of his retirement. He moved with deliberate slowness, each step measured and purposeful, as if every movement had been rehearsed 1,000 times before. The gravel crunched beneath worn leather boots that had walked through more than their fair share of hostile territory, though the young men who frequented this range would never guess the stories those boots could tell. Martin's appearance was unremarkable by design. Faded Levi's that had seen better decades, a tan flannel shirt with sleeves methodically rolled to reveal forearms marked by time and sun, and a brown baseball cap, so weathered its original blue color existed only in memory. No unit patches adorned his clothing, no veteran insignia proclaimed his service, no bumper stickers announced his allegiances. He had learned long ago that true warriors didn't advertise their credentials. They carried them silently, like scars that only showed when someone knew where to look. The range office smelled of coffee and gun oil, familiar scents that transported Martin momentarily to forward operating bases where dawn brought the promise of another day survived. The kid behind the counter, barely old enough to vote, let alone understand what real conflict looked like, nodded absently as Martin signed the logbook with his characteristic economy of motion. Last name only. Martin. No rank, no first initial, no friendly conversation to fill the morning quiet. Lane 7 had become his sanctuary, positioned at the far end of the firing line where Bluetooth speakers couldn't penetrate and the younger shooter's bravado faded to a manageable background murmur. Martin unpacked his gear with ritualistic precision. One pistol case containing a well-maintained .45 ACP, one box of 30 rounds, never more, never less, and a dented steel thermos that had accompanied him through more deployments than most people had jobs. The regulars had given him a nickname, as people always did with fixtures they didn't understand. Pops, they called him, or sometimes just the old guy, spoken with the casual dismissal reserved for those they assumed had nothing left to prove. They saw a retiree burning through his pension, a former truck driver or factory worker killing time between doctor's appointments and early bird dinners. If they paid attention at all, they noticed only that he shot exactly 30 rounds, cleaned his weapon with methodical care, and departed without ceremony or conversation. But the range staff, the professionals who observed human behavior for a living, recognized something different in Martin's bearing. There was a quality to his awareness that extended beyond normal caution, a way of positioning himself that suggested combat instincts never truly retired. His eyes didn't just focus downrange on paper targets. They absorbed the entire tactical environment, cataloging exits and angles, reading wind patterns that existed more in memory than reality. On this particular morning, the range buzzed with unusual activity. A group of Navy recruits had arrived early, their conversation punctuated by the particular brand of confidence that comes from surviving initial training but not yet facing real combat. They carried themselves with the swagger of youth, discussing their upcoming assignments and comparing their marksmanship scores with competitive enthusiasm. Among them stood Jared Collins, a SEAL candidate on temporary leave before reporting to Coronado for advanced training. Tall and lean with the kind of focused intensity that marked him as different from his peers, Jared possessed the rare combination of confidence and humility that separated future special operators from ordinary sailors. His gym bag bore a trident pin that hadn't yet been fully earned but represented everything he aspired to become. Initially, Jared paid little attention to the older civilian 2 lanes over. Just another weekend warrior, he assumed, working through whatever personal demons or nostalgic impulses drove men to firing ranges on quiet mornings. But then something in the rhythm of Martin's shooting caught his trained ear, not the volume or the recoil, but the pattern itself. 3 shots, pause, reset. 2 shots, pause, reset. Each sequence identical in timing and precision, each bullet finding its mark with mechanical certainty. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish, just the kind of economical perfection that comes from muscle memory burned into place by countless repetitions under conditions far more serious than recreational target practice. Jared found his own shooting disrupted by curiosity. He began stealing glances at Martin's technique, noting the textbook grip, the classical stance, the way the older man seemed to control the weapon rather than merely fire it. This wasn't the eager enthusiasm of a hobbyist or the competent adequacy of a former police officer. This was something else entirely. The revelation came during a reload, when Martin's sleeve pulled back just enough to reveal a small tattoo on his forearm. Not the elaborate artwork popular in tattoo parlors, not a flag or eagle or skull designed to impress strangers in bars. This was different, faded by decades of sun and wear, consisting of only 2 numbers and a simple insignia that made Jared's breath catch in his throat. He recognized it immediately, though he'd never seen one in person. This wasn't ink acquired casually or for aesthetic purposes. This was a mark earned through service, so classified that most people didn't know it existed, worn by men who had operated in places that didn't appear on official maps, conducting missions that were never acknowledged by the governments that ordered them. First Recon, Marine Force Reconnaissance, the kind of unit that ghost stories were made of. Jared's military bearing shifted imperceptibly as he processed this discovery. His casual observation became respectful attention. His competitive shooting transformed into quiet study of a master craftsman at work. When curiosity finally overcame military protocol, he approached with the deference due to someone whose service credentials dwarfed his own. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy learned in basic training. "That ink on your arm, that's First Recon, isn't it?" Martin completed his firing string with unhurried precision, set his weapon down with deliberate care, and finally turned to meet Jared's gaze. His response came without emotion or elaboration, delivered with the economy of words that characterized everything about him. Once. That single word carried the weight of classified operations, of missions conducted in radio silence, of men who had walked into situations where survival depended on skills that couldn't be taught in training manuals. Jared understood immediately that he was in the presence of something rare, a genuine operator from an era when special operations meant disappearing into hostile territory with minimal support and maximum deniability. The conversation that followed was conducted in the careful language of professionals who understood the boundaries of operational security. Martin confirmed his service dates, 1966 to 1974, encompassing the height of American involvement in Southeast Asia, and acknowledged deployment to regions that officially didn't exist on military maps. When pressed gently about specific operations, he offered only the cryptic observation that a lot of things were classified for years, delivered with the kind of smile that suggested stories that would never be told. Other shooters began to notice the change in atmosphere around Lane 7. The usual chatter died to respectful murmurs as word spread that the quiet old man they'd been ignoring was something far more significant than his appearance suggested. Jared's body language, the straightened posture, the formal address, the obvious deference, communicated more clearly than any announcement could have. When Martin finally concluded his shooting session, completing his customary 30 rounds with his characteristic precision, Jared made a decision that transcended normal social protocols. He came to attention with military formality, offering thanks for service that most people didn't know had occurred. Martin's response was to place a challenge coin into Jared's palm. Not a mass-produced souvenir, but the kind of authentic recognition that passed between warriors who understood what real sacrifice meant. The coin bore the First Recon insignia on one side and a single word on the other, "Still here." It was both a statement of survival and a reminder of those who weren't, a token that carried the weight of brotherhood forged in circumstances that civilians couldn't comprehend. Martin's parting words were delivered in the low, steady voice of someone accustomed to giving instructions that meant the difference between life and death. "You'll know when it's your time to go quiet. Until then, earn it." And then he was gone, walking into the morning sunlight with the same unhurried pace that had brought him to the range, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any war story ever could. That evening, Jared couldn't escape the encounter. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him as questions multiplied in his mind. Around midnight, he opened his laptop and began the kind of research that special operators learn to conduct: patient, methodical, using official databases and declassified documents to piece together information that was never meant to be fully revealed. Most of what he found was redacted, names blacked out, dates altered for security purposes, operational details reduced to administrative summaries that revealed nothing about the human cost of classified warfare. But buried in a forgotten MacSOG log from 1971, he discovered a single line that confirmed everything he suspected. Sergeant Thomas Martin, First Recon, Laos, March 6. Extraction under fire, recovered 7, refused medevac, wounded twice, declined award, recommendation buried. Note: asset considered irreplaceable. Now silent. That final notation, now silent, hit Jared with the force of recognition. This was the code of Martin's generation. Complete the mission, bring your people home, and never speak of what you'd accomplished. No books, no interviews, no social media posts about trauma and recovery. Just silence, carried with the same disciplined precision that characterized everything else about their service. Martin had carried that silence for decades, through a retirement that offered no recognition and a civilian world that had largely forgotten the sacrifices made on their behalf. He had become just another old man in a flannel shirt, distinguished only by his shooting ability and his preference for solitude. But now the silence had been broken, at least partially. Word spread through the military network with the efficiency that characterizes all professional communities. The following week, when Martin returned to the range for his customary session, he found the atmosphere subtly transformed. Jared was there early, not alone but accompanied by several teammates who had arrived before dawn to witness something they'd only heard about in whispered stories. They didn't intrude on Martin's routine or demand his attention, but their presence conveyed a respect that had been absent before. When he set up at Lane 7, they watched with the kind of attention usually reserved for instructors, recognizing that they were observing a master at work. The gesture that followed was small but significant. Jared approached with a fresh box of .45 ACP ammunition, not the usual 30 rounds, but enough for an extended session. "I figured 30 wasn't enough today," he said simply, offering the additional rounds as both gift and recognition. Martin accepted with a nod that lasted longer than usual, a crack in his customary reserve that acknowledged the respect being offered. He continued his shooting with the same methodical precision, but something fundamental had changed. He was no longer just another old man burning through retirement. He was a recognized veteran receiving the acknowledgement his service had earned. The transformation extended beyond that single interaction. One by one, the younger men approached throughout the morning, offering handshakes and simple words of gratitude. These weren't the performative thanks of civilians seeking to feel better about themselves, but the genuine recognition of one warrior acknowledging another. Petty, the young sailor who had joked about Martin the previous week, lingered longer than the others. "We looked you up," he admitted quietly. "Some of us, I mean. You saved a lot of people." Martin's response carried the wisdom of experience and the humility of genuine service. They saved each other. The final conversation occurred between Martin and Jared, two professionals separated by generation but united by commitment to something larger than themselves. Sitting on the wooden bench beside Lane 7, they discussed the nature of teaching and learning in their profession. "You ever think about teaching?" Jared asked. Martin's reply revealed the complexity of transitioning from combat operations to civilian life. "I spent 30 years trying to forget everything I'd teach." But when pressed about the importance of passing on knowledge, Martin offered insight that only comes from experience. "You don't teach this. You absorb it, quietly, over time." Their exchange concluded with Martin's characteristic brevity. "Don't talk so much." Both men understood that the most important lessons couldn't be conveyed through words, but only through example and observation. Before departing, Martin left the fresh ammunition untouched on the bench, a small gesture that carried enormous significance. It was both gift and challenge, recognition and responsibility. The message was clear. The ammunition belonged to those who would continue the mission, not those who had already completed theirs. That afternoon, the range staff made their own gesture of recognition. A small brass plate appeared above Lane 7, installed without fanfare or announcement. It bore no elaborate tribute or flowery language, just a simple statement. "Lane reserved until he says otherwise." Martin never asked who had installed the plaque, and he never requested its removal. Like everything else about his post-service life, he accepted it with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his military career. The story might have ended there, with Martin returning to his routine and the younger men continuing their training with enhanced respect for what they might become. But the encounter had created something more significant than temporary acknowledgement. It had established a bridge between generations of warriors, a connection that transcended the specific circumstances of their meeting. Martin continued his weekly visits to Lane 7, maintaining his disciplined routine of 30 rounds and methodical weapon maintenance. But the atmosphere around him had permanently changed. New shooters learned quickly that the old man at the end of the line wasn't just another customer, but someone worthy of respect and attention. For Jared and his teammates, the encounter became a touchstone, a reminder that the profession they'd chosen connected them to a tradition of service that extended far beyond their own experience. They began to understand that the skills they were learning had been refined by men like Martin in conflicts they could barely imagine, under conditions that would test everything they thought they knew about courage and competence. More importantly, they learned that true warriors didn't seek recognition or demand respect. They earned it through consistent excellence and carried it with quiet dignity. Martin's example taught them that the most powerful stories weren't told but lived, not shouted but whispered, not performed but demonstrated through daily choices and lifetime commitments. The lesson extended beyond military technique to encompass the entire philosophy of professional service. Martin showed them that retirement from active duty didn't mean retirement from the values that had defined their military careers. Precision, discipline, humility, and dedication to mission accomplishment remained relevant long after the uniforms were packed away and the medals stored in dresser drawers. In a culture increasingly obsessed with publicity and self-promotion, Martin represented something increasingly rare, the professional who let his work speak for itself. He had never needed external validation or public recognition because he possessed something more valuable, the knowledge that he had served with honor and competence when his country needed him most. The brass plaque above Lane 7 became a symbol of this philosophy, a quiet acknowledgement that some contributions transcend public recognition and some heroes prefer shadows to spotlights. It reminded everyone who read it that the most significant service often occurs without fanfare or acknowledgement, performed by individuals whose sense of duty extends far beyond personal ambition or social reward. For Martin himself, the recognition represented something more complex than simple gratitude. It was acknowledgement that his service had mattered, that the skills he'd developed and the sacrifices he'd made had contributed to something larger than himself. More importantly, it was confirmation that the values he'd lived by were still relevant and still respected by the next generation of warriors. But perhaps most significantly, it was proof that silence didn't mean invisibility, that choosing not to speak about one's service didn't diminish its importance. Martin had spent decades carrying his stories in solitude, not because he was ashamed of what he'd done, but because he understood that some experiences were too sacred for casual conversation. The encounter at Lane 7 proved that this silence was itself a form of service, a commitment to maintaining the mystique and dignity of special operations by refusing to commercialize or trivialize the experience. Martin's reticence protected not just his own privacy, but the operational security and professional reputation of everyone who had served alongside him. In the end, Martin's story became a reminder that heroism takes many forms, that service continues long after discharge, and that the most profound respect is often expressed not through words, but through recognition of shared commitment to values that transcend individual ambition. The young men who witnessed Martin's quiet competence that morning learned something that couldn't be taught in any classroom or training manual, that true professionals don't need to announce their credentials because their work speaks with a clarity that words can never achieve. And in a world increasingly filled with noise and self-promotion, Martin's example stood as proof that silence can be the most powerful statement of all, not the silence of those who have nothing to say, but the silence of those who have said everything that matters through their actions and their choices. Lane 7 remained reserved, not as a monument to past service, but as a reminder that the best of military tradition continues in the quiet dedication of professionals who understand that some things are more important than recognition, more valuable than praise, and more lasting than any story that could ever be told.